Hitting the record button. Welcome. We have about 19 minutes to both review kind of what we heard and really want just this to be, think of it as a working group. Sharing your stories, asking questions. I do have a slide to kind of get us started, and also some things that might have been confusing that I'd be happy to share a little bit about, but I titled this working group, a working group on changing our landscapes to meet the future. So if you remember from last week, we did have several different people who shared, one from Southern California who shared about replacing their landscaping with drought tolerant plants, which are usually native plants. And we had someone from Michigan talking about collecting and repurposing storm runoff in really wet areas. My particular interest is in this business about restoring habitat to support biodiversity. So if you're interested, we can talk a little bit more about why we had people talking about mowing less or even replacing their lawns. This piece on Pollinator Pathway Gardens that Rod shared about, I've got some more slides on that. If you're interested in knowing kind of, there's a whole movement in the US now about creating pathway gardens. And this whole thing is around creating wildlife corridors, which I will take a moment to explain when I get done. And then so many of these things, going back and replanting with native plants is really key to creating habitat that our non-human friends can share with us. And then there are ways of choosing to share our land with both people and wildlife. So the food hedges in Kitchener that we have already seen, and the programs that are being planned for the campground to celebrate the sacredness of creation. So anyway, I'm gonna stop that sharing because I'd really like to hear from you, but I do want to make a comment on the wildlife corridor at some point, why I think that is so critical and why we have this resource in our congregations that could be part of creating habitat that would allow areas of habitat that are being restored or kept set aside, that they have to be connected in order to preserve biodiversity. And that the smaller the habitat shrinks, the less land that's available for wild creatures, the fewer species will survive this mass extinction. It's a huge issue. And there have been proposals that at least 50% of Earth's land mass needs to be set aside for other creatures. And President Biden's, you've heard about his 30% initiative, which is still considered by a lot of people huge, that we need to purpose 30% of our landscape, of our land to wild creatures. And so here we are, rich with this resource, those of us with congregations and campgrounds. So I think I'm gonna leave it there. Those are sort of my preliminary thoughts about and reasons why I'm just so passionate about this particular issue. And if you want to know more about the lawns, we can go back there and talk about that. But what do you all think? What are you thinking? What have you been involved in? What are your stories? What do you want to do? And I want to say Lori Sharp, who's with us, is a master gardener. So we won't make her be an expert for today, but she probably has some things to say as well. So where are you all at on this? Barbara.
Well, I'm completely redoing my front area. And so I'm interested in, I can no longer feed my birds with bird feeders because I had a horrible mouse infestation and cost me a mint. So I need to do it all by what I plant for the birds that will sustain them through the winter. So that's what I'm interested in. And I, of course, want to make the area look like someone planned it, not just hit and miss. So I might take some pictures, Lori, and send them to you.
Oh, yeah, send them to the other Lori. No, I'm just kidding.
There's
Yeah.
there's two really good books I could suggest.
Mhm.
Douglas Tallamy has written Nature's Best Hope. There it is. And also the last one he wrote was The Nature of Oaks. He said,
Oh,
and I went to hear him speak recently, and he said that oak trees feed and house more different species of caterpillar than any other plant in North America. So if you want to feed the birds, especially in the springtime when they're feeding their babies, you want to plant an oak tree in your yard.
I highly recommend this book. He explains why it is wildlife is so important. He's the source of the quote that we used last week. I'm going to put this really up again really quickly. This quote comes from his book about the reason we heard so many people talking about letting their lawns get longer or even replacing them. And he says that lawn dominates the landscapes everywhere in all but our driest ecoregions. And there's 40 million acres in the US of lawn. And lawn is essentially a biological desert, especially when it's kept cropped short. So if you would like a little bit more background, I agree with Mike. That is exactly what I was going to do. So I'm really glad that came from you. And he definitely goes into resources for figuring out which plants in your areas. There's a couple of websites actually that there's one of them's with the National Wildlife Federation, but there are websites that actually have lists of plants, native plants, and how many caterpillars or native bees that they host and how important those particular species are. We don't tend to think of biodiversity loss as a loss of insects, but it's one of the huge places where biodiversity is being lost. And that having enough caterpillars to feed birds is essential. And that comes from planting native plants and the right kinds. And then the whole thing on oaks, I have that book, Mike. I haven't read it yet, so I'm going to be real interested to read it.
It's a great book. And
also here's, as long as I have this up, another resource that I had. So there's a new movement called Pollinator Pathways. This particular website is for the Northeast. But there's this whole movement about creating a property that is on the pollinator pathway so that they're like I'm working on planting native milkweeds that will attract monarchs in my yard. And next spring, I'm hoping, I know PJ might even be able to be, I don't know if you'd be willing to speak up, but we have a local native plant nursery who's a great resource, speaking of resources. So this gives you a sense of why creating habitat for pollinators is critical for life on this planet, and something that we can all be doing both at home and with our church families. So
to segue off of that, Lori, he has a website now, Professor Tallamy.
Oh, good. I gotta write that down.
It's called homegrownnationalpark.org. And you can, once you get the native plants into your yard, you can enter your church or your house or any property that has lots of native plants on it. It doesn't have to be all native plants, but a sufficient number. And his idea is, along with this idea of a greenway, that our neighborhoods could be linked. If we had enough people in a neighborhood that planted native plants for the insects and birds, etc., that it would eventually be vast areas of land. That's his goal.
What was the name again?
It's homegrownnationalpark.org.
Yeah, his point is that we got more land in lawns than we do in national parks.
Right.
And Mike, if you would mind, I don't know whether you could put it in the chat here, but if you were willing to put the chat and even the book recommendation when we get back to the main group, put it, make sure it gets
Sure.
into the chat so that people can find it.
Sure, be happy to.
So experiences with letting your lawns get longer, whether your neighbors like it or not. I'm
It's
looking
a
at
mess.
somebody here.
The
It's a mess.
HOA is not gonna like it, I know that.
So that's a good point.
Maybe the backyard. Yeah.
There's a lot of city ordinances that wouldn't like it either, and that you'd get in trouble with the city. But he showed some examples in this PowerPoint that I saw when I saw him in person speak. You could take a little area, just like a garden-sized area in your yard, and just remove the tops, just remove the grass, pull up, dig up the grass and plant a nice little bordered. He showed pictures of somebody with little rock borders around the edge and very neatly arranged native flowers and native plants in that little garden. And he said, anything's better than nothing.
Mhm.
Yeah, he actually shows like little serpentine pathways that you can incorporate it into your landscaping to make your neighbors think that you care about what it looks like. And
Yeah.
really what you care about is creating habitat.
Yeah, I mean, Lori, I'm real interested in trying to finesse this because, I mean, I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and it's a jungle down here. And it's like, if you let your yard grow up, it'd be full of fire ants and water moccasins.
Right.
It's like, so I'm trying to moderate this approach in a way that's useful. We also just went to an IMAX theater or science museum here, and it was a story of how that couple from Canada discovered where all the butterflies were spending their winters in south of Mexico. It was so fascinating. So we all came out of that going, we need to get more butterflies in the yard. We're trying to figure out the right kind of plants and everything. So really neat story.
Yeah.
I will say from personal experience that if you let your grass grow unmown, it doesn't really get all that high. I just moved to Bend, and my backyard had this my backyard is postage stamp size. So it kind of had around the edges vine maples and some things like that, but mostly it was just this little square of grass. And I actually hired somebody from that nursery that only sells native plants to do a plan for me so that my backyard could be a pollinator garden and a one that would bring in birds. And because I wasn't seeing that much in my relatively new neighborhood, and so I was wanting to bring those things to my backyard. And I said, I don't own a lawnmower. Can I just let the grass grow? Will that be a problem when they come in to change things? And she said, no, that's fine. We can dig it out so it can be donated, or we can just dig it out. But it's grown, I would say, maybe 2 feet tall, and it's really pretty. And I notice I get lots more birds in my backyard than I did before. And I like that. So until I get the garden that I really want, which is I just told her I want everything that has wings to want to stop by. And a chipmunk ran through one day and couldn't wait to get out of my yard. And I said, the next time it comes, I want it to go, oh, I am so staying. So anyway, if you do let it grow, it's not painful to the eyes. I think it's kind of pretty. So just my 2 cents worth. But my dad is from Chatham, Louisiana, so I get what you're saying about Baton Rouge.
Yeah, I'm sitting here trying to think how tall our grass would get every day. I know at church we lost our lawnmower and it grew pretty fast and went.
But it does eventually stop if you don't keep mowing. Eventually, it just kind of bends over and then it kind of moves in the breeze, and it's very pretty.
Yeah. Yeah.
So regional considerations though are really important. For instance, we don't have there's only 13% of the US that doesn't have a native oak, and it's a landscape. And we happen to, I'm also in Bend, Oregon. We don't have native oaks, although some people plant them, and I'm actually thinking I'd like to get some oak trees planted. So, because that's the thing I miss the most about California is oak trees.
Yeah.
You don't have any native oaks in Oregon?
Well, we do in Oregon, but this high desert, we're in the high desert.
Oh,
So we
yeah.
have native,
Yeah.
we have junipers
Very
and
pretty.
ponderosa pines.
Yeah.
Lori,
Yeah.
I just finished reading the Understory, and the
The
fellow
Overstory.
the Understory,
Oh,
about 500 pages, but
the
Richard
novel.
lives about 30 miles from me, the author. I don't know if any of you have read that or not, but just lots and lots of tree names and ventures that these, it's a novel, but it was an interesting read.
Mhm.
And it is that it's called The Overstory by Richard Powers, right?
Yeah, it's called the Overstory. Is it under or over? It might be over.
Well,
Yeah.
look it up both ways.
Well,
Really?
I just read it. It had something to do with the story. Yeah.
It's a very
Uh,
impactful story. I don't recommend it for someone who is just like needs something soothing to read. But it's a phenomenal novel. I agree.
Overstory.
It,
Yeah.
it will really impact your recognition
Yes.
that the trees are trying to communicate with us. And a
Right,
book I would
right.
recommend is Suzanne Simard, who's actually the person that was what do you call it? The inspiration for one of the characters in the Overstory. Wrote
Oh,
this book called Finding the Mother Tree. And
okay.
it is around forestry practices and whether that affects our campgrounds or not, but it's huge. It's wonderful about how it is that trees connect with the mycelia
Yes,
fungi. And I highly recommend it. It's autobiographical and at the same time explains how it is that forests are, how we're all connected and how they speak
was
to
it?
each other.
Yeah.
What was that name again?
Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard.
Mhm.
Anybody
saw
else?
it-
Linda, do you want to get, so who hasn't had a chance to get a word in edgewise here yet? Lori. Go.
Yes, you were talking about plants and diversity. I just wanted to throw a plug out there for your local extension. Please contact them for recommendations that they might have for pollinators and all the ways that we want to feed the things that we want to come into our yard, because they will have good recommendations. I mean, I live in Southwest Washington. This used to be part of the beauty of the Western red cedar landscape was part of our love and joy. And now they're recommending here, do not plant them, please, because we're losing out on the amount of water that is actually happening and falling on our yards. It's not enough to keep them alive. So contact them for recommendations about where you live.
Your agricultural extension, is that right? And
Yes.
could you say a little bit about the peat moss piece?
Oh, peat moss, yes. If you're a lover of putting things in pots like I am, there's a movement afoot, and some countries are much farther ahead of this than we are. But to find bagged soils and amendments that have no or as little peat moss as possible, because that peat in the landscape in covering massive amounts of Canada and some parts of Europe, it's great for bringing that carbon into the soil, and we don't want to lose it into pots and containers that are spread across the country. So.
And those
Yeah.
peat bog habitats are being impacted by how much is being mined for us to use in our yards. So
Yes, isn't that a sad thought?
time is up. Do you want to close all breakout rooms now? No, I really don't, but because I love this conversation. Well, it's going to close in 25 seconds because they didn't give me a chance. I will be, it'll take me a little longer because I need to convert the recording to my computer, but I'll see you on the other side. And if somebody didn't get a chance to get a word in edgewise, put it in the chat and let's keep this conversation going.
Yes, please.
Thank you.